First of all, I would like to thank the organizers and the team around the conference here for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. And also I'd like to, very short presentation, because I recently moved from Stockholm back to Gothenburg, where I'm from. I'm going to talk about the athlete's heart, when is adaptation good and when is it dangerous. And this is going to be the cardiologist view, because I'm a cardiologist. I work in cardiology. I work in sports medicine, team physician for many years, internationally and nationally. And much of the research we do is actually in physical activity for health. I did that for 4.5 years in Stockholm, the Swedish School of Sport and Health Science, but now back at Gothenburg University at Sahlgrenska. So, I would just like to start, before we talk about cardiac adaptation, to show you one of our recent studies in physical activity. I mean, we are physically inactive. So, looking at this study from the pilot study of a large 30,000 people study in Sweden about middle-aged people, which is an image study called the SCAPI study. So this is one of the pilots that we can see how much are people moving around. This is by accelerometer data. How many do fulfill the requirements, the recommendations of 30 minutes of medium or intense or vigorous physical activity 5 days a week? If you say it has to be 10 minutes at each bout, it's only 6% of the men, has been shown here, and only 8% of the women. If we allow 30 minutes of medium and vigorous physical activity 5 days a week, but don't necessarily need it to be 10 minutes at a time, it's about 30%. So a large chunk of the population is inactive, which is totally in contrast to what people say in different questionnaires. And it's getting worse. The future is getting worse. If this is bad now, it's getting worse. This is a study by Eng from North Carolina, showing that this is what we're looking forward to. All matters of physical activity, leisure time, work time, and so on are expected to go down, decrease. And the only thing that's increasing would be sedentary time, sitting still. So we have a future, even worse future predicted. So it is important to be active. It is important to get people on the move, and these new phenomena since the 70s to do running and heavy and vigorous exercise and even competing at higher age. But what happens with the heart? And your expertise then would be the cardiac adaptation to exercise. And just to repeat that, the factors influencing adaptation. And this is the normal adaptation we're looking forward to, what we're looking at. What influences that? What I'm going to talk a little bit of is the clinical implications of that as a cardiologist. So we can see here that gender, size, genetics, ethnicity, sporting discipline, and also age, not least, will influence. And also the cardiac pathology, if there is any present, will influence the adaptation to exercise. Of course, you know about the old Morgan Roth hypothesis, saying that endurance training will possibly give another sort of hypertrophy compared to strength training, which is more concentric hypertrophy. This has been in question, of course, this model for a number of years now, but still, looking at the recent paper from Journal American Society of Echocardiography, you can see that there's a clear difference between sports in different, as for runners and rowers here, looking at, for instance, left ventricular wall thickness, and looking at left ventricular mass and relative wall thickness. So indeed there are differences in different sports, and we have to take the sport into consideration when we consider the adaptation in a given athlete. And ethnicity we also have to consider. Looking at this, we can see there's a clear, many more of the black athletes will have an increased left ventricular wall thickness, which is outside the normal compared to white athletes, for instance. And it seems to be similar with the white athletes compared to Middle Asian and East Asian athletes as well. And regarding females, it has been said that the cardiac adaptation is different, and we have to take gender into consideration. But interestingly, this new paper from Hedman, a Swedish guy from Linköping, who recently published in the Scandinavian Journal, looking at the female's heart, and have a similar, although at a smaller size and smaller volumes, the cardiac adaptation in the female heart seems to be the same if you take the body size into consideration. So we do have maximal heart volumes and wall thicknesses that are much more increased in athletes, and we have to take that in consideration in the clinical context. So we allow up to 14 millimeter of left ventricular wall thickness, and diastolic volume up to 60 millimeters, increased left atrium and also aorta, and this is both for female and males. So any figures above this, of course, we have to do further assessment into looking for pathology. So is this adaptation to physical activity and intense activity, is it good? We're talking about good and bad activity. Of course, we're talking about the structural changes and the electrical changes, and those you know a lot about. We increase the chamber size and the wall thickness, but also we have a functional change and adaptation in the athlete's heart. We give enhanced diastolic filling and augmentation of the stroke volume, which the function increases in the athlete's heart, which is totally different from other hypertrophy we get in hypertension, for instance, when we have diastolic dysfunction and so on. So this is a super working heart according to function. And indeed, it has been known for many years. This is a study from the end of the 19th century by a Swedish physician from Uppsala, writing in German in those times, saying that one of the first descriptions of the athlete's heart, and this is actually this area of the heart turned out by percussion. And then this is the area, and what he did before the ski race, well, he estimated the sizes of the hearts, and the one with the biggest heart, he ended number 1 in the race. The one with the second biggest heart, number 2, and the third one, number 3. So that was the beginning of the athlete's heart, I think. So we know that big hearts is related, and indeed, since then, adaptation has been related to increase in VO2 max. Looking here, the association is clear between LV mass and VO2 max. So this adaptation does increase function, does increase capacity, and also may preserve compliance in older age. This is a study by Levine and co-workers showing that in the athletes compared to sedentary, we have an increased. They are almost, the older athletes are comparable to the young people in compliance. So it's preserved in older age. So we have an increased function, increased performance, and increased compliance. So the athlete's heart is functioning well, and it's the good adaptation. But still, it may cause trouble, even if it's good and something we are looking for. First of all, we have the clinical problem of the interpretation of the ECG in athletes, because when I studied medicine, my teacher said that every sportsman, every athlete has an abnormal ECG, so we better not look at the ECG. But now we have tried to do that and tried to get interpretation guidelines to how to interpret the ECG in athletes. And this has been developed in the last 10 years, I would say. This is one of the first studies in 2010, and then we have developed those guidelines further on. Looking here, you can see that now we group the ECG changes into common and trailing related ECG changes, which don't need any further checkup. And these are about 90%, up to 90%. And group 2, which is uncommon and trailing unrelated ECG changes, which need further checkup. But these are not enough, the 2010 criteria. So the further development of the Seattle criteria in 2013 and the refined criteria in 2014 have further decreased the false positive, have increased the specificity, and kept the sensitivity high. So we are going in the right direction with less false positives and a better interpretation and less need for further checkup to differentiate between the physiological and the pathological ECGs. And the new international consensus standards for ECG interpretation is to be published this spring, we hope. And this is in collaboration between European and US researchers in this field. So hopefully this will come this year, and further development of the ECG interpretations. Another topic which is to differentiate this good adaptation to pathology, because either you might be having athlete's heart, supernormal, or you might have cardiomyopathy. And in some cases this could be easy, most cases easy to differentiate, but in some cases you have the gray zone where it could be very difficult to delineate athlete's heart from hypertrophic cardiomyopathy or dilated cardiomyopathy. So this is one problem where the good adaptation causes a clinical problem. And recently, we have the cases of the hypertrabeculation versus the non-compaction cardiomyopathy. So, when athletes, normally with exercise, we have an epiphenomenon of the increased left ventricular preload, that's the theory, that causes increased trabeculation, called hypertrabeculation in the left ventricular wall. And this will affect up to 10% of the athletes. This will also affect pregnant women, for instance. And these are reversible changes. They go back after pregnancy and after sports. But this, sadly, fulfills the criteria for non-compaction cardiomyopathy, which was once constructed for non-athletes. So today we have the clinical problem, which is emerging and which is growing, to differentiate between the non-compaction, which is normal epiphenomenon of training, to non-compaction cardiomyopathy, which is not hypertrabeculation and a cardiomyopathy form. Usually we use things like ECG changes to try to differentiate this, among other things. But this is now a growing problem, to again differentiate good adaptation to pathology. So is there any bad adaptation then? This is the number key question, of course. Well, there is a risk of adaptation. I mean, number one here, I will go through it. It's actually not about adaptation. It's about physical activity acting as a trigger. Even if you train, you may have higher risk for some things, and as a trigger for if you have an underlying disease. But also you could accentuate or add on to existing disease with your training. The adaptation might add on or accentuate pathology. Or you could have complications to adaptation, or pathological adaptation in itself. So first of all, the physical activity as a trigger, and of course you know about sudden cardiac death in athletes, even young athletes. In the athletes under 35, it's almost exclusively inherited diseases, and therefore we try to find those 1 in 300 about, even 1 in 250 perhaps, that have an underlying disease that makes them be at greater risk for sudden cardiac death during high intensity activity. So that's why we have screening recommendations now worldwide. But already from the age of 25, coronary artery disease will be, after 35, it's almost exclusively coronary artery disease. That's the killer during exercise. Under 25, it's almost exclusively inherited diseases. But between 25 and 35, it's about 50-50, coronary artery disease and inherited disease. As shown here, illustrated here by this tragic death of the Norwegian swimmer who was 27-year-old and had triple vessel disease. So, and then number two would be accentuating existing disease. We might have cases, for example, in this case with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, that when the physical activity itself, the adaptation of physical activity do aggravate or add on to the phenotype of the disease. That could be illustrated by when you do detraining, when you stop training, the heart goes back, but also in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, it could reduce a little bit. So there is also shown in beta blockade treatment. So this actually could trigger, or not trigger, but accentuate the pathology. Another disease like that could be aortic insufficiency, another example, where the bradycardia of activity could increase the regurgitation. If an athlete has aortic insufficiency to a certain degree, when it could be very bradycardic, the insufficiency could increase. And also the dilatation of the left ventricular chamber and the cavity would also possibly increase the regurgitation and aggravate the disease. So we have to take that into consideration, and to the right you see the recommendations of the European Society of Cardiology, and we have to take that into consideration when you have an athlete with aortic insufficiency. So the third point is that the adaptation may give rise to complications. So even if it's good adaptation. And this is illustrated here by the increased, many numbers of studies showing that increased incidence of atrial fibrillation in endurance athletes, especially in higher age. And this can be, but we have to remember, again, that the highest risk of atrial fibrillation is somebody who is not training, overweight, hypertension, diabetes, and so on. This is the highest risk. And then the risk decreases as you be physically active, but maybe, or very possibly, probably increases again when you do heavy endurance exercise for many years, as has been shown in a numerous number of studies. But is it dangerous? I mean, we have done some studies in Sweden, actually looking at not we, but people in Sweden have done studies on the Swedish cross-country skiers. They do a 90-kilometer cross-country race every year, which is very, very tough, and they do this for years and years and years. And these racers, they had higher increases of atrial fibrillation, and they had it at comparable age and according to the number of races and so on. But they don't have a higher increased risk of stroke, which is interesting. But they are still treated in clinical practice with the same as every other like anticoagulation. But it hasn't been shown that they have an increased risk of stroke. So we could have a case where and sportsmen, they live longer, and athletes live longer, of course. So we could have a case where they have increased arrhythmias, but still less vascular events and less total mortality. So atrial fibrillation might not be the whole picture, because they have a lot of less risk factors in general compared to the non-skiers, and they have a longevity compared to non-skiers. And the final, maybe most interesting question would be, is there a case of pathological adaptation? And this is a subject of intense discussion now, and just illustrated here by the controversies in cardiovascular medicine. Can intensive exercise harm the heart? No. Can intensive exercise harm the heart? Yes. And you can get too much of a good thing. So this is the debate going on. What's the story? We know that the athletes, endurance and extreme endurance athletes, do get increased right ventricular dimensions. And illustrated here by some pictures from Laguerre, showing that both the ratio of right ventricular to left ventricular in volume and systolic volume and in mass is increased in athletes. So there's no doubt the right ventricle gets a lot of heavy duty with the exercise. They get changes in the right ventricle in size, and also if you look at pulmonary pressure and in vascular compliance and in afterload pressure. So the right ventricle is subjected to more pressure comparatively and relatively than the left ventricle, and especially in athletes. So they might have, and this is the theory from Laguerre and Heidbüchel, that of course ideal training, physiologic adaptation, the good adaptation will give rise to the healthy athlete's heart, with a balanced hypertrophy and little or no fibrosis. But some cases of excessive training, maybe inadequate recovery, may cause the cumulative injury with the pressure, especially on the right ventricle side, causing fibrosis, both structural and functional remodeling, which might give rise to arrhythmias and fibrosis. And then possibly also, which is not listed here, could be somebody who is genetically susceptible to these changes. So you might have this, to summarize, that in extreme activity we do have high degree of AV block and high vagal tone. We might have a sudden death, increased risk of coronary artery disease if you have underlying. We do have adverse atrial remodeling and atrial fibrillation. We might have pathological left ventricular hypertrophy and not only physiological. And we do have myocyte necrosis during races, and we haven't shown anything about that. The marathon runners who have leakage of enzymes and biochemical markers and so on. And this might give rise to myocardial scars or fibrosis, and these might give rise to ventricular arrhythmias. And these might also lead to an ARVC-like phenomenon. And this is the theory. But this is also on the extreme end of physical activity, and maybe only for some athletes. But it's my belief that it do exist. So, what do we do with high intensity activity? Is it a J curve or U curve or whatever? We know that all physical activity into a very extreme activity is good for you, but what happens in the extreme end? Is it going down? Is it leveling out? Or is it even going, having a higher risk of different complications? And the last is probably true, but this might be a long way to the right here if you're healthy and have no underlying disease. So thank you very much.